Some witnesses speak, others simply stare. In a dim London nursery, a doll sat perfectly still, porcelain cheeks, glass eyes, a painted smile. But when the police searched the room, they discovered something chilling. The doll was facing the exact spot where the crime occurred, and inside its dress was a detail only the killer could have known. Was it coincidence, a message, or something far more deliberate? That's when Sherlock Holmes was called to solve the riddle of the doll that seemed to know the alibi. Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, Holmes uncovers the secrets hidden within silence, and learns that even the smallest eyes can witness the darkest truths. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind this doll isn't just clever, it's chilling. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a mystery. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing detectives from all over the world join the investigation. So pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was one of those dim, damp evenings in late October when the fog hangs low over Baker Street, muffling the sound of carriage wheels and rendering even gas lamps into ghostly smudges of amber. I, Dr. John Watson, had just returned from tending to a patient in Lambeth, and was warming myself by the fire when the quietude of 221B was interrupted by the rapid footsteps of a desperate man on the stair. Holmes looked up from his violin with that ever-alert gleam in his eye. Prepare yourself, Watson. We are about to be visited by a man who smells of sea salt, has a nervous disposition, and carries something made of porcelain in his inner coat pocket. Moments later, a knock, then the door flung open. In stumbled a pale, wild-eyed gentleman in his middle years tweed jacket flecked with shipyard dust, salt stains at the hem, and trembling fingers clutching something wrapped in oilcloth. I caught a glimpse of a porcelain doll's hand peeking from the folds. "You must help me," he gasped. "My goddaughter is dead, murdered, and the only witness is this doll." Holmes rose slowly, his interest plainly piqued. "You have my full attention, Mr. Granger, Elias Granger. I'm a dockmaster at Tilbury," the man said, swallowing hard. "It happened 3 nights ago. They say it was an accident, but it wasn't. It was murder, deliberate, and—" She spoke before she died, said something about a lie, and the doll, she never let it out of her sight. It was at her side when she passed. No one else saw it, but I know it matters. Holmes gestured to the oilcloth. "May I?" Mr. Granger handed it over with something approaching reverence. Holmes unwrapped it carefully, revealing a delicate porcelain-faced doll with glass eyes and a neatly sewn sailor's uniform. Its expression was frozen in a grotesque smile, and one of its tiny hands was stained with what looked very much like dried blood. "She called it Mariella," Granger said. "Said it knew her secrets, like it could talk to her. She was just 7. Holmes gave a soft hum. "And where exactly was the body found?" "In the upstairs nursery of her father's townhouse, locked from the inside, the windows sealed. No one else was in the room. Her father found her at daybreak." Watson frowned. "So you believe the room was entered despite being sealed?" Granger shook his head. "That's the thing. I don't think anyone entered. I think whoever did it never left." A cold silence fell. Holmes' fingers were already moving along the doll's arms and joints with an almost surgical precision. Then he stopped. With a flick of his thumbnail, he popped open the back panel of the doll's torso. Inside, nestled in the hollow cavity, was a folded scrap of silk, clearly from a man's handkerchief, and a tiny metal key. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Curious. The child's final companion conceals a man's accessory and a key, possibly to a diary, a cabinet, or even a safe. What else has this silent witness to say? Mr. Granger's lips trembled. "That's why I came to you, Mr. Holmes. No one at the Yard believes me. Her father is a wealthy man. They're calling it a tragic sleepwalk. But I know that key is to something dangerous, something she wasn't meant to find." Holmes laid the doll on the desk beside his microscope. "Then let us begin where others have ended, Mr. Granger, with the assumption that everything we know is a lie." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We must go to Tilbury tomorrow. Watson, cancel your patience for the day. A child is dead. A doll conceals secrets, and we are asked to believe a room locked from within spells suicide. That, my dear fellow, is what we call an impossibility." Watson, still gazing at the doll's eerie smile, nodded solemnly. "Then we go to find the truth, however well it's hidden." And thus began one of the most curious cases ever to reach our lodgings, a tale where innocence and madness danced hand in hand, and where the clue that cracked the entire deception was stitched into the heart of a doll. Chapter 2: The Client's Story and Holmes. Quiet calculations. The following morning dawned as gray as the previous evening, with a low, oppressive mist clinging to the rooftops of London. As I drew aside the curtain of our sitting-room window, Holmes stood at the hearth, smoking languidly and studying the porcelain doll which now lay propped in a high-backed chair like a grotesque guest in our parlor. "It has not blinked once all night," I murmured, half in jest. Holmes gave a rare smile. "You would make a capable chronicler of ghost stories, Watson. But there is nothing supernatural about Mariella. Only secrets, and perhaps blood." At the table, Mr. Elias Granger was finishing a cup of strong tea, his expression still carrying the haggard shadows of sleeplessness. He had slept poorly, if at all, and the manner in which his hands trembled as he buttoned his coat suggested a man tightly wound. "You must understand," he said suddenly. "Lydia, my goddaughter, wasn't just a child. She was peculiar, oddly perceptive. She spoke as if she understood things far beyond her years. Her mother used to say she was touched." Holmes did not look up from the doll. "Touched by tragedy or by clarity?" Granger's lip tightened. "Her mother died 2 years ago. Consumption. Since then, it's been only Lydia and her father, Benedict Stroud. He's a man of considerable means, a shipping magnate, with connections from here to Calais. But he's cold, Mr. Holmes. Always was. He loved Lydia, yes, but he kept her guarded, not protected. Guarded." Holmes' eyes flicked upward. "You suggest the distinction is meaningful." "I do," said Granger, leaning forward. "She was kept from other children, educated privately, rarely permitted to leave the estate except for church, and there were locked doors in that house, Mr. Holmes. Always locked doors. Rooms Lydia wasn't allowed to enter. Rooms even I was not permitted to see. Yet you visited often." As often as I was allowed, said Granger. I was close to her mother. She was like a sister to me. When she died, I promised I'd look in on Lydia, but the staff were fearful. Dismissed quietly, replaced with strangers. I began to suspect something was wrong. Holmes, who had been tracing the seam of the doll's jawline with a glass probe, finally spoke again. And what did the doctor say of the girl's death? Dr. Pelhama, family man and frequent guest of Mr. Stroudrack, recorded it as a heart attack. A child of 7. Granger's face flushed. He said she must have had a weak heart and suffered a fit in her sleep. But I know the signs. Her hands were bruised. Her doll was clutched to her chest like a shield, and that key hidden inside it. What child hides a key unless they're afraid? Holmes turned to me. You see, Watson, already the narrative splinters. A heart attack is quiet, but bruises, a locked door, a hidden key, these speak of conflict, of secrecy. He walked to his desk, where a stack of unused telegrams waited. He filled one out briskly. I am sending word to Inspector Lestrade, not to interfere, mind you, but to ensure Scotland Yard does not bury this beneath polite fiction. Now, Mr. Granger, tell me more of Benedict Stroud. What do we know of him? Granger frowned. A hard man, ruthless in business, cultured, educated, wealthy, but there were whispers about how he acquired his fortune, about strange business dealings with the continent, and then there's the matter of his brother. Ah, Holmes said softly. A brother. Jacob Stroud, said Granger. Vanished nearly 5 years ago. Some say he was disinherited after a quarrel over money. Others say he was mentally ill and kept out of public view. I once caught a glimpse of a photographed 2 brothers, nearly identical, but the second man was always removed from conversation. Holmes nodded slowly, returning to the doll. The absence of a man can sometimes weigh heavier than his presence. We must ask then, why does this doll wear a sailor's outfit? Why a doll at all? If the girl was kept isolated and controlled, what significance does this key hold, and to whom might it belong? Watson, observing Holmes with growing intrigue, posed the question aloud. You believe the key was planted there by Lydia herself? I believe, said Holmes, lifting the doll's glass eye with a probe and revealing a tiny shard of wax lodged beneath it, that Lydia knew far more than she was ever allowed to say. And perhaps, being silenced, she found her own method of speech. Holmes pressed the wax into a dish, examined it under his lens, and gave a low hum of interest. Sealing wax, blue, French, a shade not commonly found in England since the last decade. Likely from a letter or envelope of import. He stood abruptly. We must go to Tilbury at once, Watson. Have your revolver handy. Not because I expect violence, but because it would be imprudent to enter a sealed house of secrets without being prepared. Granger looked between us, his voice low. You believe she was murdered? Holmes met his gaze coolly. I believe a child left us a puzzle, and puzzles demand solutions. Outside, the mist had thickened, shrouding London in silence. As we descended the steps of Baker Street, the carriage wheels seemed to vanish into the fog ahead, carrying us not merely toward Tilbury, but toward a locked room, a ghostly doll, and the truth that trembled behind a dead child's final secret. Chapter 3a. Nursery sealed in silence, the journey to Tilbury was a somber affair, conducted mostly in silence, as the gray countryside rushed past in a blur. Holmes reclined in his corner of the carriage, eyes half closed and fingertips pressed together in his habitual attitude of thought. I, meanwhile, watched Elias Granger closely. The dockmaster sat rigidly upright, his eyes fixed out the window, but his hands ever trembling betrayed an undercurrent of dread that had yet to leave him as the train pulled into the terminal and we made our way to the Stroud residence. The fog clung to the Thames like a burial shroud. The house itself, an old Georgian townhouse overlooking the water, rose from behind a wrought iron gate. Its windows darkened as though it were reluctant to witness the world outside. We were met at the door by a stern-faced woman in mourning black who introduced herself as Mrs. Ketch, the housekeeper. She eyed us warily, particularly Holmes, whose sharp gaze flicked over her with surgical precision. "You are expected," she said. "Mr. Stroud is not receiving, but you may speak with me, and you may view the nursery under supervision." Holmes inclined his head. "We require no more than that, Mr. Watson, Mr. Granger." She led us through the house, its silence oppressive. The drawing-room curtains were drawn, the carpets thick and muffling. Everywhere was a sense of stillness, not peace, but suppression. At the foot of a narrow staircase, she paused. "The girl's room is at the top. Nothing has been touched, not even for burial arrangements." Holmes asked lightly. She hesitated. Mr. Stroud insisted everything remain until authorities confirmed there was no foul play. Holmes nodded without expression. "Very good. Let us proceed." The stairs creaked beneath our weight, the air growing colder with each step. At the end of the corridor, the nursery door stood closed. Mrs. Ketch drew a heavy brass key from her apron and unlocked it. Stepping aside, I followed Holmes into the room, and immediately a chill ran down my spine. It was a child's room. Yes, but it had the sterile neatness of a place unused. A four-poster bed stood against the wall, white drapes drawn tight. Toys lined one shelf, wooden animals, paper dolls, and books with cracked spines. But there was no color, no clutter, no sign of a child's daily joy or mess. Holmes walked the perimeter in silence. I saw his eyes touch the frost on the inside of the single window pane, the scuff marks on the floor near the toy chest, the overturned footstool beside the bed. "She died in the bed?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Ketch nodded. "She was found lying on top of the covers. Her hands were blue. The doctor said she passed in her sleep." Holmes stepped to the window and examined the latch. Secure, no signs of tampering. The frost indicates the window remained closed during the night. He turned, surveying the room once more. "Mr. Granger, where was the doll when you last saw it?" Granger moved to the edge of the bed. "She always kept it here on the pillow beside her head. When I found her, it was clutched against her chest." Holmes crouched to examine the bed frame. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dust on the sill. And yet, he pointed to a faint smudge on the wall just above the headboard. There, wax, the same blue residue we found beneath the doll's eye. But why here? Holmes retrieved a lens from his coat and leaned in. "It has a shape, a seal, impression partial, but distinct. Watson, what does that suggest to you?" I bent to look. "That someone pressed a sealed envelope against the wall." "But what purpose? To frighten," said Holmes. "To threaten, or to confess." He rose, brushing his coat. There is a hidden correspondence at play here. And our little Marielle child, though she was, had the foresight to conceal the key to it within the doll. Holmes moved to the bookshelf next and began scanning titles. Children's fables, moral tales. But this is curious. He drew out a thin volume titled The Silent Sailor. Its spine was cracked and pages thumbed. He opened it to reveal a hollow, carved into the center a rough cavity, just large enough to hold a folded paper or key. Empty. Holmes showed it to Granger. Someone searched this, likely before Jess, after the girl's death. The doll was the second hiding place. The first was compromised. Granger's face paled. Then she knew she was in danger. Holmes returned the book and turned to the wardrobe. And now let us see what secrets the dead leave behind. He opened the door. A row of dresses hung neatly, but what caught our attention was a locked drawer built into the base. Holmes removed the doll from his satchel and inserted the small key into the lock with a soft click. It opened. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with faded ribbon. Holmes withdrew one and scanned it briefly. His brows lifted. "They're not addressed to Lydia," he said. "They're written by her." Granger whispered. She could barely write. Holmes handed the letter to me. The handwriting was crude, but legible. The spelling bore a child's uncertainty, yet the message struck like thunder. "Papa says Jacob went away, but I hear his steps at night. I think he's in the wall," I told Mariella. "Mariella told me to hide the key." Holmes stepped back. "Gentlemen, we are standing in a nursery where a child claimed to hear footsteps within the very walls. Her dead uncle, said to have vanished, and a secret so potent she carved it into a doll's heart." He turned to the door. "This is no ordinary locked room mystery. This is a house that hides its ghosts well." And with that, we descended the stairs in silence, unaware that something had shifted behind us in the cold nursery above. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Shadows Downstairs. The air was no warmer than the chill that haunted the nursery. Holmes had fallen into one of his silences, the kind that signified the furious worry of unseen wheels behind his sharp eyes. We returned to the drawing room, its curtains still drawn and hearth unlit, though a faint scent of extinguished smoke hung in the air. Elias Granger paced nervously before the cold fireplace. Holmes remained standing, glancing once at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. "Mrs. Ketch," he said, "I should like a word with the other household staff. If they've been instructed not to speak to outsiders, do kindly inform them they are speaking now to Scotland Yard's unofficial conscience." The housekeeper narrowed her eyes but nodded. "They'll speak to you if only to protect themselves." She disappeared into the depths of the house. A moment later, the door creaked open, and a trio of figures shuffled in. An aging man in a gardener's coat, and a wiry boy of perhaps 14 who seemed too well dressed for a stable hand. Holmes gestured toward the settee. "Do sit, this needn't take long." The servants obeyed. Holmes regarded each in turn. "I am not interested in gossip. I am interested in fear. And you are all afraid." The gardener, a lantern-jawed man with a voice like gravel, cleared his throat. "Beggin' your pardon, sir, but strange things do happen in this house." Holmes nodded slightly. "Go on, Mr. Tom Bridger, sir. Been heir 20 years. Knew the old master, Benedict's father. Even Jacob, when he were still about. Holmes' expression barely shifted, but I noted a flicker in his fingers, his version of a satisfied hum. "Jacob Stroud," Holmes said. "Tell me what happened to him." Bridger hesitated. "He was wild, that one. Too clever by half. Made his fortune in odd corners smuggling, maybe, or worse. Came back here after some row with Benedict. He said the house was rightfully his, but he wasn't well. Would lock himself away for hours, talk to the walls like they was listening. And then he vanished," Holmes said flatly. "Aye," Bridger muttered. "One day he was here, next he was gone. They said he went abroad, but no one saw him leave. Not even the boy here, who sleeps above the stable." Holmes turned to the boy, who fidgeted under the scrutiny. "Your name?" "Henry, sir. You heard anything odd the night Lydia died?" Henry looked down, sobbing, not loud, just soft, like from upstairs. And then something Elsa's scraping sound, like stone on wood. Holmes stilled. "Scraping," Henry nodded. "But when I asked, they said it was the wind." Holmes turned to the maid. "And you?" She wrung her hands. "The child. She wasn't afraid of the dark. But the last week she wouldn't sleep unless Mariella was in her arms. Said the doll could hear footsteps behind the bookcase." Watson frowned. There was no crawlspace there. Holmes said nothing. He stepped to the corner of the room and opened a cabinet, searching absently before removing a pair of candlesticks. If a man wished to vanish, he might do so more completely in a house like this than in any back street of London, especially if he helped build the vanishing place himself. He turned back to Bridger. "When this house was constructed, were there renovations made? Walls altered, rooms expanded?" The gardener scratched his beard. "Aye, about 10 years ago. Jacob's idea. He had the library redone. Some of the servants said he added a chamber behind it, something hidden. Said it was for wine, or for watching," Holmes murmured. "Thank you. That will be all for now." When the servants had departed, Holmes turned to Granger. "We must examine the library at once. Watson, bring the doll." We followed Holmes down a shadowed hallway to a set of oak doors. The library within was richly appointed, dark-paneled walls, floor-to-ceiling shelves, and thick red drapes drawn tightly against the outside world. The scent of dust and varnish clung to the air. Holmes moved along the back wall, tapping each wooden panel lightly with his knuckles. "Ah," he said at last, pausing by a section that rang slightly hollow. "This, Watson, is not a wallet, is a promise." He examined the edges of the bookcase, running his fingers along the molding. No latch, but he stopped at a particular volume, The Origin of Species. With a swift motion, he pulled it forward. There was a mechanical click, and a portion of the wall creaked inward, revealing a narrow door no more than 4 feet wide. Beyond it yawned darkness. Holmes took the candle and struck a match. "Gentlemen, what say you to a secret passage in a house where a child claimed to hear ghosts in the walls?" We stepped inside. The space was tight, the walls bare stone. A shallow stair led downward into shadow. I felt the air grow cooler, damper. The passage curved. Then we entered a small room. It was no larger than a pantry, and it stank of mildew and rust. A single wooden chair stood in the center, and beside it, an old oil lamp still, half full. On a shelf, a stack of old journals, faded letters, and a small tin box, But what chilled me most was the single cracked mirror on the far wall, facing the hidden slit in the bookshelf from the other side. A watching place, Holmes murmured, stepping closer. He could see the library without being seen, perhaps even the nursery if the passages are connected. He opened the tin box. Inside lay a passport, a photograph, a letter, and a small coin etched with a symbol I did not recognize. The passport bore a name, Jacob Stroud. The letter was addressed to Benedict. Holmes read silently, his mouth tightening. Then he returned everything and closed the box. This house is built not on stone, but on silence, he said at last. And Lydia, poor soul, may have disturbed it. As we ascended from the dark, a deep dread settled over men, of ghosts, but of men who vanish into walls, and children who try to speak the truth through the eyes of a doll. Chapter 5. A brother's silence and a convenient suspect. We emerged from the hidden passage into the dusky warmth of the library. But the room no longer seemed merely a study. With the knowledge of the slit in the wall and the watching mirror, every shelf and shadow now carried a weight of suspicion. Holmes moved with quiet precision, replacing on the origin of species and restoring the secret door to its deceptive invisibility. "Mr. Granger," he said, brushing dust from his coat, "you have known this household a long time. Have you ever seen Jacob Stroud's body? A casket, a burial, any trace of a man who supposedly vanished 5 years ago?" Granger shook his head slowly. "Only his name, spoken like a ghost, whispers, avoided even in passing. Lydia used to ask about him, but her father would always change the subject." Holmes nodded, as if expecting the answer. "I suspect Jacob never left this house. I suspect he's been here watching, hidden, and perhaps growing mad. And if so," I asked carefully, "could he be the one who harmed the child?" Holmes gave no immediate answer. Instead, he stepped to the hearth and lit the library's oil lamp with a match. The flame danced, illuminating his sharp features. "We are faced with two possible crimes, one long concealed and one recent. If Jacob lived behind these walls, then someone enabled that concealment, someone who benefited from his disappearance and from Lydia never learning what her uncle knew." Just then, the door opened. A man entered, tall and grim, with silver at his temples and cold eyes that surveyed the room with a soldier's authority. His presence silenced us instantly. He wore mourning black, yet his collar was too crisp, his boots polished too brightly. Grief did not hang from him, it was merely tailored to fit. "I was told," he said in a low voice, "that a Mr. Sherlock Holmes is trespassing in my house." Holmes did not turn. "Not trespassing, Mr. Stroud. Investigating." Benedict Stroud's eyes narrowed. "By whose authority?" "By the child who died in a locked room," Holmes replied calmly, "and by the doll that held a key." For a long moment the air was taut as piano wire. Then Stroud's lips curled faintly. "Ah, Elias has infected you with his paranoia. You are here about Lydia and her toy." "She was not simply a child," said Holmes, "and the doll not merely a toy. You knew that, didn't you?" Stroud's expression didn't waver. "I knew my daughter was imaginative, fragile. She often spoke to herself, created stories. Some children do." "Do all children hide keys in their dolls?" Holmes asked. "Do they write notes about footsteps in the walls?" Benedict's brows twitched just slightly. Then he spoke, measured and cold. She was a lonely child. Her nurse left after falling ill. Her tutors rotated often. She had few anchors, Mr. Holmes. I see what game you are playing, and, I warn you now, I will not have my house turned into a theater. Holmes met his gaze with stillness. No, I dare say you much prefer your theater remain behind the walls. Stroud's jaw tensed. You overstep. But Holmes did not flinch. Not yet, but I am very close. With a glance to me, he moved past Stroud and exited the room. I followed quickly, and Granger came after, visibly shaken. In the corridor, Holmes paused only long enough to say, "Keep your eyes on him, Watson. He's not mourning a daughter. He's protecting an empire." We returned to the front of the house. A carriage had drawn up, and to my surprise, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was just stepping down from it, brushing soot from his coat and looking irritated even before he had reached the threshold. "Holmes," he said, exasperated, "I received your telegram. What in heaven's name is this about? Dolls, passages, dead children." "Not just dolls and children," Lestrade Holmes replied. "A man who disappeared without a trace. A child who died in a room no one could enter, and a house full of watchers, pretending not to see." Lestrade sighed. "You're always so poetic. Can we begin with something practical?" Holmes nodded. "Very well. Bring your men. I want every wall on the north side of the house examined for hollow space, especially behind the nursery and library. If you find a body or a living man hidden within, you'll have your practical." Lestrade blinked. "You think there's someone alive in there?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Granger. "You said Lydia mentioned something else before she died. Something about a lie. What were her exact words?" Granger closed his eyes. She said, "Mariella knows he lied. He said the letter never came, but it did. I saw it in the study." Holmes smiled faintly. "Thank you. That is all I needed." He turned to Lestrade. "And now, my friend, while your men take to their hammers and tape measures, I shall take to the study. Because if Lydia saw a letter that was supposed to be lost one that proved a lie, then it must still exist." "Why would it?" Lestrade asked. Holmes' eyes glinted. "Because even liars keep trophies, especially when guilt is the only thing that proves control." The inspector called for his constables, Dot and Holmes. With the doll in hand and the fire of truth in his stride, disappeared into the study, where the house's true confession likely waited folded in silence, sealed in blue wax, and never meant to be found. Chapter 6. The letter that was never sent. The study of Benedict Stroud was as austere as the man himself. Dark leather-bound tomes lined the shelves. A writing desk of heavy mahogany stood before a curtained window, and above the hearth hung a portrait of Lydia, painted in somber pastels. Her eyes, fixed eternally toward the viewer, seemed to carry some unspoken warning. Holmes stood before the desk with the doll cradled in one arm, his other hand gliding over the drawers with delicate purpose. I watched him work, sensing the shift in his bearing. No longer was he the curious visitor. Now he was the silent hunter, each movement sharpened by purpose. He opened the central drawer and removed its contents: stationery, sealing wax, a steel pen, and a box of unused envelopes, all unremarkable. But then he paused at a false bottom and produced a narrow blade from his coat. In moments, He had pried the compartment loose. Inside lay a single folded sheet, wax-stained and brittle with age. Holmes held it to the light. Blue wax, French, the same that stained the nursery wall and the doll's eye. He read the letter in silence, then handed it to me. It bore no signature, but the handwriting was tight and elegant. The contents chilled me, Benedict. You cannot keep her locked away. She knows. She hears me at night. You took what was mine, but you cannot take the truth from her. One day she will tell. One day they will listen. You cannot hide forever behind your dead wife and locked doors. Jacob, double quotes. Good Lord, I muttered. Then the quarrel between them never ended. He was in this house, and Lydia knew it. Holmes was nodding. It is the letter Lydia mentioned. She said she saw it in the study. Stroud told her it never arrived. But it did end. He hid it. Likely, before Jacob vanished, was made to vanish. The last words hung heavily in the air. Holmes folded the letter and replaced it carefully in his coat. This confirms two things. 1. Benedict feared his brother, not just for what he might do, but for what he might reveal. 2. Lydia knew more than he ever suspected. He turned to the portrait above the hearth, studying it with narrowed eyes. Even in art, she looks as though she knew the house was watching. A knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. Lestrade entered, brushing cobwebs from his coat. We've begun the wall search, he said. Your instincts were sound. There's a passage running behind the nursery and across to the south wing. We found bedding in one section, recently disturbed. Holmes smiled. You'll find the full truth soon enough, but I doubt your quarry is still in the walls. Lestrade frowned. You mean to say? I mean, Holmes said, walking past him. He may have come out. We followed Holmes swiftly back toward the grand hall, the echo of his steps striking the marble like a clock counting down. At the base of the stairs, we found Mrs. Ketch. I need to speak with Benedict Stroud, Holmes said. Where is he? The housekeeper looked visibly shaken. He said he was retiring to his private study, West Corridor. Locked the door behind him. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Break it. Lestrade blinked. Holmes, now. Without waiting for assent, Holmes turned and strode down the West Corridor. We followed, the tension crackling through the narrow passage like the promise of a coming storm. At the end stood a plain oak door, shut and silent. Holmes knocked once. No answer. Lestrade sighed and motioned to the constables behind him. With a hard thrust, the door was forced open. The scene within was stark and shocking. Benedict Stroud sat at his desk, still and composed, a tumbler of amber liquid untouched beside him. His face was pale. In his right hand, he held a revolver pointed not at himself, but toward the open window. On the sill, streaked with mud, were footprints. Small, deliberate, recent. Holmes strode in and examined the revolver, unfired, yet clearly held in anticipation. Lestrade checked the window. Opened from the inside. These prints. They came from the wall behind the garden. Holmes nodded grimly. So Jacob did leave the walls. Just not the grounds. Stroud stirred. He had not spoken since we entered. Holmes crouched beside him. Mr. Stroud, you have one chance to speak before your brother does, because he is not gone. He is not dead, and I believe he came for you. Stroud's voice was low and hoarse. He threatened my daughter because she knew, Holmes asked gently. Stroud closed his eyes. Because she listened. I told her not to, but she believed she could save him. Holmes stood. What did you do to him, Benedict? I fed him, Stroud whispered. I let him stay. In the beginning, he begged. Said he had nowhere else. But he changed. He spoke to Lydia through the vents, told her stories, lies about me, about her mother. I warned him to stop, Holmes asked. So you sealed him in? I blocked the far passage, Stroud said. Left him one route out, but I never thought he'd reach her room. Watson stepped forward. Did you hurt her? No, Stroud said, fiercely, rising. But I found her cold, bruised, clutching that doll. I knew he had frightened her to death. Holmes turned. And yet, you told no one. I couldn't, Stroud rasped. I had already lied so long. Lestrade motioned to his men. Find Jacob Stroud. Sweep the grounds. Search every shadow. As the constables moved out, Holmes turned to me, his voice quiet. And so the red herring comes into view, Watson. A father fearful, yes, but not the murderer. The puppet master remains hidden. I looked at him. Then who? He lifted the doll. Mariella knows. And with that cryptic remark, Holmes walked away, leaving silence in his wake and the mystery deepening behind him. Chapter 7. What? Mariella remembered the dusk pressed low upon Tilbury as we returned once more to the drawing-room, its shadows lengthening across polished floors and brooding portraits. Outside, Lestrade's constables crisscrossed the garden with lanterns and barked instructions, hunting for a ghost who had already slipped their grasp. Inside, Holmes sat with the porcelain Dalmary Lapilisting in his lap like a mute conspirator. Watson, he said, without looking up, you recall how Lydia wrote that Mariella knew the lie? I nodded, still unsettled by Stroud's broken confession and the fresh footprints that had climbed into his study window. She believed the doll to be more than comfort, Holmes continued. A confidant, certainly, but I suspect she used it as a recorder of secrets. A recorder? I asked. Holmes, the doll. Not magical, Watson, he said with a faint smile. Mechanical. Observe. He turned the doll over once more. Where previously he had exposed a cavity inside the torso, a hiding place for the key, he now examined the neck seam with more intent. With delicate effort and a thin-bladed scalpel, Holmes loosened a layer of porcelain that had been subtly sealed with wax. A small click, then a faint whirry noise. I stepped closer. From within the doll came a gentle mechanical ticking, like the winding of a music box, only slower, more deliberate. It's a voice cylinder, Holmes murmured. A tiny one, custom. A toy for the wealthy and eccentric. The sort of thing a man like Benedict might indulge for his daughter, without realizing the precision of its mechanism. Granger, seated near the hearth, leaned forward, breath catching in his throat. Do you mean? She spoke into it. Holmes nodded. More than once, I suspect. Likely in private. Likely when frightened. The ticking ceased, and a soft, scratchy sound emerged no louder than a whisper. We leaned in, then a child's voice. Mariella. I heard him again last night. Papa says I dream it, but I know it's real. He knocks in threes. Always threes. I counted them. He says I should never tell. But if I hide this, and I die, you have to tell Mr. Granger. Tell him the letter came. The voice cut off. Then another began. He said Mama didn't fall. He said Papa pushed her. But I don't believe that. Do I, Mariella? I don't know. Maybe he lies too. Maybe everyone lies. The cylinder whirred to a stop. The doll fell silent. Granger rose slowly, his eyes wet. Dear heavens. Holmes remained still, listening even after the sound had ended. She was recording not only her fears, but the very threads of contradiction in the household narrative, he said at last. It confirms Jacob was alive within the walls and speaking with her. But more curiously, it suggests he may have been manipulating her. I frowned. But for what purpose? To what end? That, Holmes replied, is what we must determine next. At that moment, Lestrade returned, brushing wind from his coat. We found something, he said grimly. Not Jacob, but a place. South Garden, beneath the old rose arbor. There's a hatch, sealed from inside. Took us the better part of an hour to force it. Holmes stood at once. Show me. We followed him through the house and out into the night. The garden had grown more eerie with darkness, the fog drifting like low smoke among the hedges, beneath the twisted limbs of the rose arbor. A square opening now yawned in the soilen old gardener's storm shelter, long abandoned and overgrown. Lantern light glinted off steps that descended into earth. The air that rose from it was stale, sour, and unmistakably lived in. Lestrade led the way, and we followed, our boots echoing on the iron stairs. The shelter below was larger than expected, with rotted shelving, cracked bottles of preserves, and a battered mattress in one corner, and at its center, scrawled in chalk across the walls, were strange markings. Holmes stepped forward. Watson, your lamp. I handed it over, and he traced the symbols carefully, sets of 3 vertical lines, over and over, interrupted by scrawled phrases in shaky handwriting. Not a lie. Not a lie. She listens. She hears. The child listens. She sees. He stole it. He took her. The letter? The name. He's the ghost. Not me. Stop knocking. Stop knocking. Stop knocking. Granger turned away, visibly shaken. He lost his mind. Holmes studied the markings in silence. Not entirely. He feared being forgotten. But more than that, he feared being misremembered. These ramblings reveal a truth. Jacob believed himself the victim. And Lydia? I asked. She was the last voice to hear both sides, Holmes said. And so she became a threat. I glanced uneasily around the walls. Do you believe Jacob killed her? I believe, Holmes replied. He was preparing her for something. Whether that was an escape, a revelation, or a final act. But her death interrupted a plan. Lestrade, inspecting the mattress, held up a small scrap of fabric. From a child's nightdress, he muttered. Fresh, torn. Holmes turned to me. You recall the bruising on Lydia's hands? I nodded. Yes, defensive, you thought. I did. But now, he said, I wonder if she fought not an attacker, but herself. Perhaps, in terror, she struggled with what she was told to do, which was, I prompted. Holmes looked at the voice cylinder in his palm. Perhaps to open the nursery window. Perhaps to let someone in. Outside, the wind shifted. The roses overhead rustled, as though disturbed by breath, and from the hedge beyond, a figure watched by the time Lestrade turned with his lantern. The figure was gone, but not before we all saw the glint of moonlight on a face. Holmes whispered, Jacob is no longer in the walls. He's in the open, and he's listening. Chapter 8. Holmes tests the edge of the truth. The brief sighting of the pale figure in the hedge left our party stricken with silent urgency. Lestrade ordered his men to fan out across the grounds, lanterns swaying like fireflies amid the dark hollies and topiary. But Holmes, calmer than all of us, stood unmoving, his eyes narrowed in thought rather than alarm. "He's close," Holmes murmured, "too close to be desperate. He wanted us to see him." That was no flight, it was a message. "A message?" I asked. Holmes turned to me, the faintest curl of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, Watson. Think, if Jacob Stroud has lived in the shadows of this estate for years, evading servants, police, even his brother. Why break cover now? Why reveal himself the moment we discover his hideaway? To threaten us?" I ventured. "No," Holmes said. "To tempt us." We returned to the house, the wind hissing faintly along the eaves, like a restless whisper. Inside, Mrs. Ketch had gathered the remaining staff in the drawing-room at Lestrade's insistence. The servants sat stiffly, eyes darting toward the windows at every gust of wind, none daring to speak above a murmur. Elias Granger stood by the hearth, visibly shaken yet composed, like a man clinging to conviction. Holmes motioned me to follow, and ascended the stairs toward the nursery once more. "I require one more conversation," he said under his breath. "With Lydia." I stopped at the threshold. "Holmes." But he had already entered. The room had not changed. The white curtains hung lifeless over the bed. The toy shelf remained undisturbed, and the frost had returned to the inside of the window pane. Only the air felt different now, heavier, expectant. Holmes stood at the center of the room and placed Mariella upon the pillow. "She was clever," he murmured. "Too clever for a child. Clever enough to doubt even the voices that whispered from the walls." I remained by the door, unsettled by the solemnity in his tone. She was being pulled in two directions. Watson, Holmes continued. Her father, ever distant, cold, guarded, and Jacob, hidden and wild, feeding her secrets, warning her of lies, all through the cracks in the house. But what if neither man was telling the truth? I stepped closer. "You mean?" "Someone else, entirely." "I mean," Holmes said slowly, "there is a third hand in this house." He reached into his coat and withdrew the letter from Jacob we'd found in the study, its seal broken, its message bitter and obsessive. Holmes held it beside one of Lydia's earlier letters, retrieved from the hidden drawer in the wardrobe. "Note the handwriting," he said. I leaned in. "Yes, the slant is similar, but too similar," Holmes finished. "The strokes are controlled, neat, suspiciously neat. Lydia was 7. This level of symmetry is unlikely. I believe someone guided her hand, perhaps even composed it for her." I stepped back, the implication sinking in. Then her own words, "Her fears may have been shaped," Holmes nodded, "by someone who wanted her to distrust her father, to believe a lie within a lie." He turned to the window and inspected the latch again. This time, he did not test the glass or the frost but the sill. From beneath the left corner, he pried up a sliver of wood and revealed a thread of dark cloth, caught in a nail-head. "Wool," he said, "from a coat. Not Benedict's, he favors linen. Not Jacob's either. He lived in rags and bedding. No, this belonged to someone else entirely." A sound downstairs cut through the stillness, the sharp clatter of porcelain. Holmes moved at once. We descended quickly, just as a constable called from the main hall. "Sir, The dollet's been moved. Mariella now lay toppled on the stairwell landing, one porcelain hand broken clean off. Holmes bent to inspect the fracture. Inside the hollow of the doll's arm, barely visible, was something wrapped in ulis, kin. With delicate care, he extracted it. A photograph. Holmes held it up. It depicted Lydia and another young girl, perhaps a year older, both standing beside a familiar stone bench in the garden. Lydia clutched Mariella tightly in her arms. The other girl, dark-haired and severe, stared directly into the lens expression, unreadable. Granger gasped. "That's my niece, Marjorie, Lydia's cousin." Holmes' expression darkened. "Where is she now?" Granger hesitated. She's here. Has been upstairs. But she's ill. Confined to her room for weeks." Holmes stood abruptly. "Take me to her, now." We followed Granger to a guest room in the east wing. The housemaid stood outside nervously. "She don't answer, sir," she said. "Locked the door." "She did. Hasn't spoken all day." Holmes stepped forward. "Stand aside." He rapped once, then turned the handle. The door was locked. Holmes bent swiftly and inserted a thin tool into the keyhole. With a twist and a click, the door swung inward. The room was dim, curtains drawn. The air smelled of stale perfume and ink, and in the corner sat Marjorie, motionless in a high-backed chair, in her lap a second doll, not Mariella, a twin, and at her feet a set of drawing charcoals. Holmes stepped forward. "Miss Marjorie," he said quietly, "we've been listening to the wrong doll." Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his. And for the first time, I saw something behind them that chilled me to the marrow. Not madness. Calculation. Holmes turned to me and murmured, "The alibi." "Watson, the doll's name wasn't Mariella. It was Marjorie." And the girl in the chair smiled, just faintly, before the storm truly began. Chapter 9. The cousin's doll and the painted life are a long, stretched moment. None of us moved. Marjorie Granger sat perfectly still in the twilight of the room, her hands resting gently on the lap of the second porcelain doll. Though the shape was near identical to Mariella, same sailor dress, same glassy eyes, this one bore a red ribbon around its neck and a subtle chip beneath one eye, like a tear that had hardened into stone. Holmes advanced slowly, his voice low but crisp. "This doll, Miss Marjorie. It isn't Mariella, is it?" Marjorie blinked once. "No, she named hers. I named mine." Holmes crouched to eye level. "What did you name it?" There was no hesitation. "The Witness." I felt the weight of that name settle like dust on cold stone. Holmes continued, gently, but with steel beneath his words. "You were close to Lydia, weren't you?" "I was her shadow," she said simply. Granger stepped forward, alarmed. "Marjorie, why didn't you tell me you were with her the night she died?" "You said you had taken ill." "I had," she said, turning to him with flat calm. "A fever. But not that night. That night I was wide awake." Holmes stood now, studying the girl with the same intensity he gave murder scenes. "You placed the photograph inside Mariella, so someone would find it," she replied. "So you would know." "Know what?" She looked down at her doll, stroking its cheek. "That I saw her let him in." Lestrade had entered during the exchange and now stood to one side, scribbling notes. "Let who in?" "Uncle Jacob," Marjorie said. "He knocked 3 times, just like he always did." And she opened the window. Holmes asked, Did you see him enter? I saw the window open. I saw a figure pass through it. I couldn't sleep. I'd left my room and sat in the hallway. I followed her to the nursery door. I waited until she was inside, and then I watched, and you told no one. Marjorie's face twisted. Who would believe me? Papa thought I was sick. Uncle Elias was never here long enough, and Uncle Benedict, he already hated me. I saw the way he looked at her, like she was made of glass, like she mattered more. Her fingers tightened around the doll. I wasn't going to be invisible. A silence fell. Even Lestrade, who had begun to speak, lowered his pen. Holmes moved to the window and drew the curtain aside. Moonlight spilled in, illuminating Marjorie's pale face. You've been listening to them speak about Lydia for weeks, he said. You've heard their theories. You saw them search the walls. Why come forward now? Marjorie hesitated. Because I thought maybe it was all my fault. Granger stepped closer, kneeling beside her. Marjorie, no, I saw her go, Marjorie whispered. I saw her open the window, and the next morning she was gone, and he was gone. I thought maybe she ran away, or he took her. But when I asked the nursemaid if she'd seen the window open, she said it was locked, shut tight. She must have shut it again herself, Holmes said, to hide what she'd done. Marjorie nodded. But I didn't know that until you said it, until you found Mariella. Holmes looked at the second doll again. And your doll, the witness, did you tell it what you saw? Marjorie nodded. Everything. Holmes turned the doll over in his hands, examining it with meticulous care. This one had no compartment, no hidden latch, but beneath the hem of the sailor dress, stitched into the lining, was something. Holmes deftly pulled it free. A tiny sheet of folded drawing paper. He unfolded it. A crude child's sketched girls by the window. One with a doll, one reaching for the latch, and above them a dark figure looming in a square frame. Holmes studied it. You remembered with pictures what you couldn't say aloud. I didn't want her to die, Marjorie said suddenly, her voice cracking for the first time. I only wanted her to be scared, just once. Like I was always scared. Granger put a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't acknowledge it. Holmes tucked the drawing into his coat. Your silence, Miss Marjorie, has spoken volumes. You have done what many adults in this house refused to do. You remembered. And you told the truth, even when it cost you. She said nothing more. Holmes turned to Lestrade. I want Jacob Stroud found before night turns again. Search the hedgerow where we last saw him. If he believes his hold on this house has returned, he'll stay close. But now he knows Marjorie has spoken. He may act. Lestrade nodded grimly. We'll post constables at every entry. Granger remained behind as we left. I glanced back once to see him kneeling before the girl, the flame of the fireplace casting them both in a solemn orange hue. Back in the corridor, I asked, Do you believe her, Holmes? Holmes gave a slow nod. I believe she saw something, whether it was Jacob or someone posing as Jacob. That remains to be seen. But she has moved the knife edge of this mystery, and with it we begin to see the shape of the wound. And Lydia, I asked softly, do we know yet what truly happened to her? Holmes stopped at the landing and looked down into the shadows of the house. No, he said, but the dolls have stopped whispering, and now the men must speak. Below, the wind rose again, but this time there were no knocks at the window, only the sound of footsteps pacing the hedge, waiting. Chapter 10. A voice in the hedge the next morning arrived as little more than a continuation of the night. A heavy fog rolled inland from the estuary, settling over Tilbury like a second skin. From our rooms at the far end of the estate, Holmes rose before first light, already dressed and staring through a crack in the curtain, eyes fixed on the garden below. "He is still out there," Holmes murmured. I rubbed sleep from my eyes. "You're certain?" He revealed himself once. He won't wait long to act again, especially now that Marjorie has spoken. He turned sharply. We must force his hand. Before I could question him, Holmes had swept out of the room. By the time I reached the breakfast parlor, Lestrade and Granger were already seated, the former reading through a sheaf of reports while the latter stirred a cold cup of tea without purpose. Mrs. Ketch loomed at the doorway, her arms folded across her apron like a statue carved in worry. Holmes entered briskly, coat unbuttoned, boots still damp with morning dew. "Lestrade," he said, "order your men to pull back from the hedges. Make it look like we've given up the search. Leave only one man at the rear of the property, unarmed and visible." Lestrade raised a brow. "Visible? You want him to be a target?" "A lure," Holmes corrected. "Jacob has seen the eyes watching him. If they suddenly vanish, he'll assume they've lost interest or lost direction. He'll grow bolder, and if he's armed—" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then he will make a noise, and we will have him." Lestrade left at once, muttering about the mad genius of the method. Granger stood, uncertainty etched on his face. "And what of Marjorie? What if she's still in danger?" Holmes turned. "She's not the one he fears anymore. It's you, Mr. Granger. Me. You've been the one voice in the household who never looked away. Jacob knows that. Lydia trusted you. That makes you dangerous to him." Granger swallowed. "Then what do I do?" "Be visible," Holmes said. "Be exactly where he expects you. In the chapel." Granger blinked. "The chapel?" "Yes," Holmes said. "Where Lydia is being laid to rest, alone, quiet, unattended, as Benedict wished. You think he'll go there?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that whatever Jacob intends to confess or destroy, he will do so where it all began." It was nearing 10 o'clock when we entered the Stroud family chapel, a small stone building, overgrown with ivy. It stood behind a row of ancient oaks on the edge of the grounds. Inside, it was bitterly cold. A single shaft of light pierced the dusty stained glass, falling across the wooden casket at the altar. Holmes instructed the constables to wait out of sight behind the trees. Granger took his place in the front pew, alone but composed, staring forward into the pale stillness of the room. Holmes and I remained in the shadows behind the altar screen. "Now," he whispered, "we wait." Time passed slowly. The fog beyond the stained glass seemed to creep inward. The silence in the chapel became a living thing. Then, movement. The rear door creaked open. A man stepped through, thin, gaunt, a face hollowed by shadow and time, hair like untamed straw, a long coat buttoned wrong, boots caked in earth. His eyes flickered across the pews, then fixed on Granger. "Elias?" The figure rasped. Granger turned, heart visibly hammering in his chest. "Jacob," he whispered. I felt Holmes go still beside me. Jacob Stroud stepped forward, his limbs oddly stiff, like a marionette, barely held together. He stopped a few feet behind Granger. "You came," he said. Granger rose slowly. "I never left, Jacob." The ghost of a smile passed across the man's face. "But she did." He pointed to the casket. "She was supposed to stay," he muttered. "She was going to tell everyone. But she got scared." "Did you hurt her?" Granger asked quietly. Jacob blinked. "No, she hurt herself. The truth bent her." Granger took a step closer. "Then tell me, Jacob, tell me what happened." Jacob hesitated. "She let me in. She always said she would. I told her to wait until the house was asleep. She opened the window. I came to speak to her. That's all. But when I climbed in, she was crying." "Why?" "She found the other letter. The real one." Holmes tensed beside me. Jacob went on. "I never wrote that threat. The one in Benedict's study. I never wrote to him. I wrote to Lydia. I told her about Mama." Holmes stepped forward now. "Then who forged the letter?" Jacob didn't seem surprised by Holmes' presence. "Someone who wanted her to believe I was dangerous. Someone who wanted her afraid." He looked up at the stained glass, as if trying to see something beyond it. "She ran from me, screamed. I tried to stop her. She tripped on the stool, hit her head." His voice broke. "I didn't mean it." Holmes stepped closer. "Then why did you flee?" "I thought they'd blame me." "And?" I heard a second voice. In the hallway, a second voice. Jacob nodded. A girl's voice, not Lydia's. She was whispering behind the door. Granger's voice trembled. "Marjorie." Jacob shook his head. "No, not hers either." He turned to Holmes, sudden clarity blazing in his eyes. "There's someone else. I've seen her. A woman. She watches the graveyard at night, wears black gloves, carries a lamp. She whispered to Lydia when she thought no one listened." Holmes stilled. Jacob took a step backward. "I think she made the lie. I think she's the reason we're all still here." And then, from the door, a voice rang out hoarse and furious. "You should have stayed dead." Mrs. Ketch stood there, a pistol in her hand, and this time Holmes moved fast. Chapter 11. The Housekeeper's Confession. Mrs. Ketch stood framed in the chapel doorway, her black dress billowing in the wind that followed her, pistol leveled with a steadiness that belied her age. Her usually expressionless face was flushed now, teeth clenched, eyes gleaming not with madness, but with long-restrained fury. Jacob froze. His hands rose slightly, fingers trembling. Granger instinctively stepped in front of him, placing himself between the weapon and the shattered man. Holmes, ever watchful, lifted one palm in a measured gesture. "Easy, Mrs. Ketch. That is a weapon best held in silence." She did not lower it. "He should have stayed in the walls," she hissed. "Like a rat. Like the rot he brought with him." Lestrade had entered from behind, now drawing his revolver in turn. "Mrs. Ketch, drop it, slowly." "No," she barked. "You think you've solved it? You think this creature told you the truth?" She jabbed the pistol toward Jacob. "He wasn't innocent. He watched her," whispered through the cracks, "night after night, poisoning her mind, telling her about her mother, about how she fell." Granger spoke, calm but firm. "You were the one in the corridor that night. You heard them." "I always heard them," she snapped. "That's what a proper housekeeper does. She hears what no one else does. She sees what the family hides." Her voice grew shriller. "He would have destroyed this house, just like he destroyed her. Holmes took a step forward. So you forged the letter. She turned to him, lips curled. It was the only way to protect her, to make her doubt him, to keep her close to her father. But even that didn't work. She opened the window. Holmes nodded slowly. And when she fell, you saw your chance. Her fingers twitched on the trigger. You moved her body. Holmes continued, voice level. Set the room straight. Locked the door from inside using the pulley latch System 1 I suspect Jacob himself had once rigged, perhaps long ago, as a boy. Her eyes flickered. Holmes pressed. You framed the death as a tragic, sleepwalking accident, but not to protect Benedict, not to protect Jacob, to protect Lydia, she snapped. The room fell still. I served her mother, you see, Mrs. Ketch whispered. From before the wedding, when Jacob was the favorite son, when Benedict was just the quiet one in the corner. Her voice trembled now. But Jacob, he grew bitter, unpredictable. He wanted everything his brother had, even the wife, especially the child. I felt my stomach twist. Holmes said softly, so you tried to keep him away. I warned her, she said. I told her not to listen. But she believed him. She let him in. She looked at Jacob now, years of hate in her eyes. And he was in that room when she died. Jacob, pale and shaking, whispered. She hit her head. I didn't touch her. I didn't get the chance to say goodbye. You didn't deserve the chance, Mrs. Ketch growled. Holmes spoke again, low but firm. You manipulated a grieving house. You removed servants who questioned the story. You silenced Marjorie with pills and locked doors. You ensured that Lydia's story would be buried with her. Mrs. Ketch's hands quivered. I kept this house whole. And yet, Holmes said, you did not foresee the doll. Silence. Holmes continued, voice growing colder. Mariella, the only thing you could not control. A porcelain thing, carved for comfort, made into a confidant. A vessel of truth you could not monitor. He stepped between her and Jacob now. And now, here you are, in the chapel. Gun drawn, prepared to finish what you began, not out of cruelty, but obsession. Lestrade moved then, slowly circling to her side. You should put it down, ma'am, he said. We've heard enough. But Mrs. Ketch no longer looked at Jacob. Her eyes had drifted to the casket at the altar. I buried her myself, she murmured, washed her hair, placed the doll beside her. I wanted to believe it was peaceful. Her arms sagged, the pistol wavered, and then, with a shudder, it fell from her hand and clattered against the stone. Lestrade stepped forward and retrieved it. Take her into custody, he said to the constables outside. They entered swiftly and led the old woman away. She did not resist. Only once did she look back, the coffin, and whisper something none of us could hear. Holmes turned to Jacob, who had slumped to the floor. She was trying to protect the child, Holmes said. But the line between protection and possession blurred long ago. Jacob nodded faintly. I never wanted to hurt Lydia. Granger crouched beside him. Then help make it right. Tell them what you know. Jacob looked up. I can do that. Holmes said nothing more. He turned and approached the coffin, resting his hand on the polished wood. He remained there for a moment, his eyes distant, as though seeing not the grave, but the web that had led to it. When we returned to the manor, the sun had begun to pierce the fog for the first time in days. Light touched the windows of the nursery, and the doll named Broken and burdened with truth, rested once more on her shelf, beneath a window that no longer opened. Chapter 12. Echoes beneath the floorboards. The house had fallen quiet, not the silence of sleep, but something more final, the hush that lingers after a confession has been spoken, and the weight of years unburdened. Mrs. Ketch had been escorted from the chapel with her head high and her eyes strangely hollow. She did not weep, she did not plead. Only once did she glance back, and that was not at us but toward the nursery window, where a pale curtain stirred as if it too were watching. Holmes said little on the walk back to the main house. Jacob Stroud had remained behind under Lestrade's cautious supervision, seated in the chapel under guard, a man unraveling slowly at the seams. Granger walked beside us, his coat flapping in the breeze, face gray with the strain of truths laid bare. "She believed she was saving Lydia," he said at last. "Mrs. Ketch, I mean." Holmes did not look at him. "Obsession frequently dresses itself in duty, Mr. Granger, and madness prefers the mask of loyalty. She wasn't saving the girl. She was silencing her." Inside, the lamps had been lit against the overcast morning. I followed Holmes up the stairs, once more back to that quiet, haunted nursery. The doll Mariella still sat where we had last left her, resting against the pillow as though she had never moved. But everything had changed. Now we understood that Lydia had not whispered to a toy. She had screamed into an empty house and left behind porcelain proof. Holmes crossed the room slowly, studying the floorboards beneath the window. "There's one last question left unanswered," he said. "One final thread." I watched as he crouched, fingers brushing along the grain of the wood. He paused at a slight seam, then reached for the small blade in his pocket. "I suspected it earlier, but lacked the evidence," he murmured. "The scrape marks here, the tiny crescent scratches near the sill, they suggest a compartment was opened. Not recently, but often." With a deft movement, he pried up the board. Beneath it, nestled in a shallow recess, was a small velvet pouch. He lifted it gently and unfastened the string. From within, he withdrew a locket on a gold chain, a delicate thing with two miniature portraits inside on one side, a young woman, beautiful and pale. On the other, a child no older than 7. "Her mother," I breathed. "And Lydia." He held it in the lamplight. "Mrs. Ketch said she served the mother before the marriage. She told us Jacob was obsessed with the family, but the truth, Watson is simpler and far more human." He turned the locket over. Etched on the back, in worn but legible script, were 2 initials, J.S. Jacob Stroud. Holmes said softly. "The portraits belonged to him, not Benedict." I frowned. "You believe Jacob was Lydia's true father?" Holmes gave a slow, solemn nod. "It would explain the rift, the sudden disappearance, the whispers in the wall, Benedict's frigid distance, Ketch's hatred. Everything fits." He returned the locket to the pouch and replaced the board carefully. "Lydia must have found it, hidden away in her floor, perhaps told by Jacob in one of his midnight conversations. That discovery, more than anything, may have fractured her completely." I stared at the bed, at the quiet doll beside it. "And she didn't know who to believe." "No," Holmes agreed, "but she believed enough to open the window." A knock at the door stirred us. Lestrade appeared, face tight. "He's confessed," the inspector said, "to the hiding, to the late-night visits, but he insists it was an accident." And with Mrs. Catch's forged letter, her manipulation of the scene, well, the court will debate what to do with them both. And Marjorie? I asked. She's gone home with Granger, for now, Lestrade said. The doctor says the girl isn't magist, deeply wounded. Holmes, you were right. She saw more than she ever understood, and tried, in her way, to help. Holmes simply nodded. We left the nursery together. As we descended the stairs, a faint creak echoed behind us, just the settling of the house, perhaps, or the soft memory of footsteps that once walked the corridors with doll in hand by late afternoon. We were back at the Tilbury rail station. The fog had lifted, and the river gleamed faintly in the distance. Holmes stood on the platform in silence, his gloved hands folded behind his back, coat-tails fluttering in the breeze. You're still thinking of Lydia, I said. He nodded. She did what no adult in that household dared. She tried to find the truth. She found it, perhaps, but she was too young to carry its weight. I asked gently, do you think she died because of Jacob, because of Mrs. Catch? Holmes looked to the horizon. She died because of secrets, because no one would speak plainly when it mattered. Children always listen when no one else does. The train arrived in a billow of steam as we boarded. Holmes paused, looking back once at the edge of the platform, as if expecting to see a girl there, pale and small, with a doll pressed to her chest. 13. A key left in silence. We returned to Baker Street, with dusk crawling behind us, the London skyline washed in soot and copper. Holmes was unusually silent throughout the journey. He had sat by the window the entire ride, face half-lit by the golden spill of carriage lamps, eyes distant. Not once did he speak of the case. Back at 2-1B, Mrs. Hudson met us with a concerned expression and a tray of warm tea, which Holmes accepted absently. He stood at the hearth, gaze fixed on the fire, and did not touch his cup. I watched him from my chair, waiting. I had seen Holmes in many moods, exhilarated by victory, irritable in idleness, quietly pleased by a well-sprung trap, but this was something different. There was no gloating in him tonight, no thrill of the unraveled knot, only reflection. After some time, I broke the silence. You're still uneasy. Holmes spoke without turning. A child died, Watson. And though the cause is now laid bare, justice in such matters is often a pale substitute for what was lost. I nodded solemnly. And yet Lydia's story is now known. You've ensured that. He tilted his head, the corner of his mouth twitching faintly. The truth, once buried, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface like Jacob through the walls. But this case, it leaves questions still. I sat forward. You believe something remains unresolved. He turned finally, eyes sharpening. Tell me, Watson, why would a man hide a locket beneath a floorboard, one containing the image of a child he believed to be his own? To protect it, I offered. Holmes shook his head. A man like Jacob would boast of such a truth if he thought it gave him claim to the family. He would confront Benedict with it, not bury it. I furrowed my brow. You suspect it wasn't Jacob who hid it? Holmes moved to his desk and pulled out the pouch we had found beneath Lydia's floor. He held it up, weighing it in his hand. The velvet is too fine. Not something a reclusive vagabond would possess. The thread used to tie it braided dark green matches no fabric found in Jacob's shelter. but it does match the trim of one woman's apron. Catch, I whispered. Holmes nodded. It was she who hid it, but not to protect Jacob. He placed the pouch on the desk gently. She hid it to erase Jacob's connection, to ensure the locket would never be found. Lydia must have discovered it, by chance perhaps prying up a loose board, as children do. And once she did, the old woman's control began to fray. But that means... I paused. Catch knew of Lydia's true parentage. Holmes turned sharply. More than that, she knew before the girl was born. I stood slowly, and she raised her loyally guarded, her knowing all the while. She believed herself guardian of both the child and the house, Holmes said. A protector, but her loyalty twisted into possession. She resented Jacob for what she saw as a betrayal, and resented Benedict for his cold indifference. And when Lydia sought out her own answers that would append the fiction she so carefully maintained, Ketch intervened. My throat was dry. Holmes, do you believe it was truly an accident, Lydia's fall? He was silent for a long moment. I believe Jacob told the truth about that night, Holmes said at last. But I also believe Mrs. Ketch saw the girl's faltering resolve, saw the moment fear crept in, and used it. She may not have pushed Lydia boot, she pushed the story that followed. She constructed the locked room. She crafted the narrative. She chose the ending. I sat back, heart heavy. And Marjorie? Holmes's eyes softened. A casualty of silence. She saw what the others wouldn't, and in her child's mind, she played at detectives reconstructing clues with dolls and sketches. She understood that the adults around her were telling stories, so she crafted her own truth. He paused, then added quietly, "She'll carry the weight of that night for the rest of her life." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the torn sketch Marjorie had hidden in her doll's hem. He pinned it gently to the mantel, beside our firelit shadows, a crude drawing to girls, one doll, one open window, and a black figure outlined in charcoal. He studied it for a long while, then, softly, "Children draw what they cannot say." We sat in silence, the fire hissing softly beside us. Outside, the city carried on horse hooves, clattered over wet cobblestones. A carriage bell rang, and distant laughter echoed through the mist. I watched Holmes, my friend, the man too often thought machine, now lost in thought over a child's drawing. "Will the law see it as you do?" I asked. "They may," he said, "or they may not. But that no longer matters. The truth is no longer hidden beneath floorboards. It breathes." I refilled his cup and mine. We drank not to victory, but to understanding, and for the first time in many nights, the flat at Baker Street felt still, not with silence, but with peace. The case of the doll that knew the alibi had been closed, but in its quiet unraveling, it left us both changed. Chapter 14. The library's final whisper. The days that followed our return to Baker Street passed in a measured hush, as though the house itself were observing some period of mourning. Holmes, though less withdrawn than before, had not returned to his usual state of restless intellectualism. He neither picked up his violin nor reached for his monographs on criminal chemistry. Instead, he spent long hours gazing into the hearth, sifting the same 3 lines of chalk Jacob had scrawled on the shelter walls in Tilbury. He stole it. He took her. The letter, the name. He's the ghost, not me. It was late in the week when a letter arrived, handwritten ink, still blotched, sealed with wax, that bore the crest of the Tilbury estate. Granger's handwriting was unmistakable. Holmes opened it without ceremony and read in silence. I watched his brow knit only once before he passed the page to me. "Mr. Holmes, I regret troubling you further, but something strange has occurred. During the clearing of the estate, we uncovered a concealed drawer behind the fireplace in the library. Inside, we found pages torn from a journal. Though unsigned, they appear to be in Mrs. Catch's hand. I thought it prudent to send them to you directly. Yours, Elias Granger." Holmes took a fresh breath. It appears the house is not finished speaking. By afternoon, a courier delivered a package bound in twine and stained with soot. Holmes opened it carefully, laying out its contents on our table. Within were 5 pages loose, yellowed, with a precise and obsessive pen. They reeked faintly of lavender, water, dust, and something else beneath a deeper, iron scent that made me think of tears. Holmes read aloud, voice steady, tone measured. September 17th. I watched her today through the nursery keyhole. She's begun brushing her hair in the mirror, the way her mother did 12 strokes, always the left side first. I wonder if it's instinct or memory. She hums that same tune again, the one he taught her. I cannot bear it. October 2nd. He spoke to her again. "I heard the knock 3 times, she answered. She always answers. I warned her, and she wept. But it changes nothing. The whispering begins after midnight. I pad the nursery door with cloth to dull it. Still, she listens. Still, he poisons her." October 9th. I found the locket. She had hidden it beneath her mattress. I burned the photograph, but kept the gold. It was Benedict's mother's chain, after all. I buried it behind the grate. That's where secrets go. Behind flame. October 13th. She looked at me with her mother's eyes today. It broke something. I saw it. In her gaze, something cracked and shifting. I cannot let her become her mother. I cannot let him take her like he took the rest. October 15th. The doll knows. They speak when I am not near. I can feel it in the air, the murmur of threads pulling tight. I have no more time. If she tells, the house will fall. I must silence it. Holmes set the final page down and leaned back in his chair. "So," I said quietly, "it was not guilt that broke Mrs. Ketch, but inevitability. She believed she was holding the walls together." "She wasn't," Holmes said. "She was sealing the rot inside." He steepled his fingers, eyes narrowing. There is something deeper in her words, and understanding not just of Jacob's madness, but of the house itself, as if she had come to see the structure as an organism, living, watching, whispering. I nodded slowly. It would explain her fear of the doll. She didn't just dislike it. She feared it as though it had agency. Holmes looked toward the fire. In a household of liars, a silent witness is the greatest threat. The journal pages were placed into our case files, but Holmes did not release his mind from the matter. He rose and crossed to our bookcase, pulling down a volume on familial delusions and obsessive psychosis. He flipped through it with idle precision. "You know," he said, "there was a moment when I doubted the existence of a crime at all, when it seemed everything we uncovered was misdirection, accidents of madness and coincidence. But it wasn't," I said. "It was a crime, even if not one that leaves fingerprints." Holmes looked at me. Indeed, the crime was in the silence, in the omissions, in the carefully constructed realities that held a child captive, until her only voice was a porcelain figure stuffed with secrets. He turned a page and paused. The idea of using dolls in testimony is not new. In some cultures, children confess only through a puppet, a familiar, a vessel that allows truth without ownership. He closed the book. Lydia made Mariella her confessional, her ally, and through her we were forced to listen. I crossed to the desk, where the charcoal sketch from Marjorie still rested against the lamp. The little girl with the open window. The figure, the dark, round eyes of the doll, watching from the sill. They were all whispering, I said, and only a child could hear them. Holmes replied with unusual softness. Sometimes, Watson, it is not the facts that solve a mystery, but the willingness to listen to what has no voice. That night, I did not write in my journal. Instead, I sat by the window, listening to the crackle of the fire, to the breath of the city below, and to the faintest rustle perhaps imagined of fabric on wood. As if a small, glass-eyed sentinel had shifted ever so slightly in her seat, and remembered. Chapter 15. The return to Tilburyette was a gray morning when the second telegram arrived. I was seated at our breakfast table, reaching for the marmalade, when Holmes emerged from his bedroom the envelope already open in his hand. Without a word, he handed it to me. The signature was again Elias Granger's, but this message bore none of the polite restraint of his last. Mr. Holmes, the manor is not at rest. Last night, one of the constables posted to the library corridor swears he heard footsteps behind the fireplace, followed by a whispering voice calling for Mariella. No one else was in the house. Jacob is in custody. Mrs. Ketch has not spoken a word since her arrest. I would not trouble you again, but I fear there is something left unresolved, something still breathing within the walls. Please return. E.g. I folded the telegram slowly. Footsteps again, behind the fireplace. Holmes poured a splash of tea into his cup and stirred it without interest. The house has not finished revealing itself. You think it's more than superstition? I think, Holmes replied, that Tilbury House was built not only of timber and stone, but of secrets layered so densely that even when its inhabitants are gone, the structure continues to echo with their intentions. He downed the tea in one swallow and reached for his coat. Pack lightly, Watson. The walls have one last whisper to give. By the time we arrived at Tilbury that afternoon, the sky had darkened with low clouds, and the wind bit sharp off the Thames. Granger met us at the manor gates, his face pale beneath his cap. It wasn't just the footsteps, he said as he led us inside. Books fell from the study shelves. One of the nursery dolls was found at the bottom of the staircase. Again Holmes's eyes flicked to me, then back to Granger. Which doll? Granger hesitated. Mariella. She was locked in a display case, Holmes murmured. That's why I sent for you. The house had not changed. Its corridors remained wrapped in that familiar hush. The windows thick with condensation, the oil lamps flickering in shallow sconces. And yet something was different. Less oppressive, perhaps, but still restless. We made our way to the library, where Holmes began his inspection anew, moving with focused purpose. He knelt before the hearth, his fingers tapping softly against the soot-blackened bricks. You mentioned the constable heard the sounds here. Granger nodded. He swears it. Behind the fireplace. He said it was as if someone were pacing, slow and deliberate. Holmes pressed his ear to the side of the hearth. For a long moment he was still. Then he turned to me. "Fetch me a lantern and a length of twine." I returned moments later with both, and he looped the twine around his wrist, handing me the slack. "If I pull twice, wait 1 minute, then come after me." I blinked. "Come after you." Holmes reached into the firebox, pried up a loose stone near the grate's left corner, and exposed a dark cavity. From it, a hidden passage yawned open no wider than a crawlspace. Descending steeply beneath the house, "I believe, Holmes," said voice, echoing slightly, "that Mrs. Ketch buried more than a locket behind this hearth." And with that, he vanished inside. I stood, twine in hand, heart thudding as the dark swallowed his figure. The flame of the lantern bobbed faintly, then disappeared altogether. The minute dragged, then another. The twine remained still. I tightened my grip and prepared to follow. But before I could move, the cord gave a sharp tug once. Then again I dropped to my knees and slipped into the passage. The air was close and sour, the stone walls slick with condensation. I crawled forward until the tunnel widened slightly, and I caught up with Holmes. Crouched beside a small alcove, at its center stood a crate. Not old, but not new either. Carefully crafted. Latched, but not locked. Holmes had already opened the lid. Inside lay 3 items. A folded shawl, the color of mourning. A journal with its pages meticulously dated, and beneath them, an envelope sealed in the same blue wax we had seen on the nursery wall. Holmes handed me the letter. "Open it." I did so carefully, the paper brittle, but UNMARRED. To be opened only if the girl is lost. Inside, in Mrs. Ketch's hand, was a confession of a different nature. There was another child. Before Lydia. A daughter, born in shadow, illegitimate, hidden. She was placed with strangers to protect the family's name. When Jacob returned, he learned the truth. He sought her out, found her. Her name was Clara. She died at 8 years old. I buried her here. This house is her grave, and the girl who followed was her echo. Lydia was never meant to replace her, but I could not help but see her as such. Mariella was Clara's. She whispered, first to her, and now to no one. I stared at the paper, my breath gone. Holmes gently closed the crate. "There it is," he said, the final whisper. We emerged from the passage into the failing light of the library. The house had fallen still again. The weight of what lay beneath its foundation had been uncovered. Not in crime, but in grief. Holmes stood at the hearth, brushing soot from his coat. The dolls, the drawings, the whispers in the walls. They were never only Lydia's. They belonged to Clara first. A ghost carried forward not in spirit, but in memory. And Ketch. She preserved her like a relic. I could say nothing. Holmes looked around the room one final time. Tilbury has held too many children in silence. "Watson," he said, "and now it must let them go." And with that, we turned from the fire and left the room to its long-awaited peace. Chapter 16. The Doll That Knew the Alibi. We left Tilbury behind beneath a bruised sky. Its chimneys receding through the window of the rail carriage, like the spires of a long-forgotten dream. Holmes sat opposite me in our compartment, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the envelope that lay between Usta final letter, sealed in faded blue wax, bearing only the word Clara. He had carried it in his pocket since we left the hidden passage beneath the hearth. Now, at last, he placed it on the table and spoke. "There is no alibi, Watson," he said quietly. "No locked room puzzle. No blood-stained blade. And yet," he tapped the letter once with a long finger, "this case was as much about guilt as any we've encountered." I nodded. The house held so many secrets. It's a wonder it stood at all. Holmes leaned back, folding his arms. And the doll Mariello, she did not merely know the alibi. She was the alibi. I looked at him, puzzled. "Explain." He smiled faintly, as if awaiting the question. "We must return to the earliest assertion. Lydia, according to Jacob and Mrs. Ketch, was growing fearful, conflicted. She believed herself caught between two opposing forces, her father, distant and unreadable, and her uncle, whispering to her through walls. But there was a third presence, the doll. And what did she say to Mariella? I recalled the voice cylinder. He said the letter never came, but it did. I saw it in the study. Holmes nodded. And more importantly, she told Mariella what she dared not tell the adults. She confided in the only thing that would not interrupt her would, not challenge or punish. That made Mariella her refuge, but also her witness, and thus her alibi. I began to understand. So when she opened the window to let Jacob in, she left behind a safeguard, Holmes said. A final confidant. She knew the truth would be twisted, just as her world had been. She recorded it in the doll-coded, through whispers, through drawings, through hidden compartments. He tapped the sealed envelope again, and in the end, it was not Jacob's voice or Mrs. Ketch's grip that proved the pivot of this tragedy was Clara's absence. The name sat heavy between us. Holmes opened the envelope now with careful precision. Inside was a single folded chiton, unfinished letter written by Lydia's mother. Eleanor Stroud. My dearest Benedict, I write this without knowing whether I will ever send it. Jacob has returned again, and with him the question I buried years ago. I fear Lydia will learn the truth that she was never meant to be ours alone. I fear that if she does, she will come to hate me, but I could not live with losing her, not again. Clara was the name we gave her, though I never saw her face. I heard only her cry. Ketch said she passed before her first breath truly began. But in dreams, I see her standing in Lydia's place, watching, always watching. Forgive me if I do not tell her. Forgive me if, in silence, I protect what little I still have. Holmes folded the letter and let it rest beside his teacup. I believe, he said slowly, that Mrs. Ketch did not lie entirely. There may never have been a living Clara. She may have passed in infancy, but the idea of her haunted every person in that house. She became the shadow behind every curtain, the voice behind every wall. And Ketch, she built her own theology around that loss. And Lydia became the echo, I murmured. Holmes nodded. The substitute child, the second chance. And when Lydia grew curious, when she began to untangle the fabric Ketch had so carefully woven, she became, in Ketch's mind, a threat to the legacy. She said as much, I added, that she couldn't let her become her mother. Indeed, because Eleanor had doubted. Eleanor had loved Jacob, and perhaps, in the eyes of a controlling servant, that was the original sin. Holmes stood now, crossing to the window. The countryside blurred past fields, distant trees, the skeletal forms of wind-beaten barns. "And Jacob?" I asked. "Do you believe him?" "I do," Holmes replied. "He was many things, stable, desperate, obsessive, but not a murderer. He returned to claim what he believed was his, a connection to Lydia. But by then, Ketch had already cast him as the villain. The doll sealed it." He turned from the window and looked at me. "Which brings us to the doll's final role. It was more than a toy. It was the repository of the truth and the thing no adult anticipated. It was, in the purest sense, Lydia's mind made tangible." I nodded. "Her testimony, her diary, her shield." Holmes gave a rare smile. "Precisely. It recorded not only what she feared, but what she knew. And in doing so, it undid every lie the house had hidden." We fell silent then, the train wheels clattering beneath us like distant thunder. Baker Street welcomed us home in the hush of early evening. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, fussing over the soot on Holmes' coat, but he said little. He returned to the sitting room, where the fire had already been lit, and opened his notebook to jot down a few lines, then closed it again without writing. "I poured us both brandy to Lydia," I said softly. Holmes raised his glass to the one who remembered what others forgot. We drank in silence, the doll's final whisper still echoing in our thoughts. And though the case was closed, I suspect neither of us would ever forget the cold weight of porcelain on a child's pillow, or the alibi carved not in words, but in silence. Chapter 17. Closure at the Edge of Memriette. Was 3 weeks after our final departure from Tilbury that the last piece arrived, not in a crate or envelope, but in the form of a person. I was returning from my surgery on a rainy Tuesday morning when I found Holmes already deep in conversation with Elias Granger in the parlor at 221B Baker Street. Granger looked older, the lines at his mouth deeper, though his eyes held a quiet steadiness they had lacked before. He rose as I entered. "Dr. Watson," he said with warmth, "you'll forgive the sudden visit. I had a promise to keep." Holmes gestured to the small object on the mantel, wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine. "Mr. Granger has brought us a relic." I stepped forward and unwrapped it slowly. It was Mariella, repaired now, her cracked arm restored, the sailor's ribbon freshly tied. She looked less like a bearer of secrets, and more like what she had once been, a child's companion. "She no longer belongs in Tilbury," Granger said. "We're boarding the house up for good. The estate will pass on, eventually. But Mariella, she should be remembered, not buried." Holmes regarded the doll with a cool, unreadable expression. "Have you heard anything further from the authorities?" Granger nodded. "Mrs. Ketch remains silent. She speaks to no one, not even the magistrate. Her counsel is arguing diminished responsibility. As for Jacob, he's been moved to a sanatorium. The doctors say his mind is too fragmented for trial. He mutters of letters, of fire, of dolls watching him through walls." "And Marjorie?" I asked. "Recovering slowly. She's begun speaking again, mostly to my sister. She remembers more than we thought. Not just the night Lydia died, but the years before. Secrets Ketch kept from all of us." He looked at the doll now. "She's asked for Mariella once. I said the doll was being looked after." Holmes turned to the window. "It's a house that absorbed the pain of 3 generations, and when it could hold no more, it let it spill." Granger nodded. Yes, but there's one more thing. From his coat, he produced a folded envelope. He handed it to Holmes. It was found in a box of Eleanor's old things. One of her last writings, I think. I think she meant it for Lydia, though it was never sent. Holmes opened it carefully. And we read it together, my dearest child, if you are reading this. Then the things I could not say aloud have found their way to you. There are truths in this house that are heavier than any child should bear. About your uncle, about your father, about the sister you never met. But know this, none of it defines you. You are not the echo of our sins. You are the light we hoped for. You are not what came after. You are what should have come first. I am sorry. Mama. Holmes folded the letter slowly, almost reverently. There it is, he murmured. The thing Lydia never received. The truth spoken plainly. The thing everyone else danced around. Granger's voice was soft. Would it have changed anything, do you think? Holmes looked to the fire, his eyes far away. Perhaps not the outcome, but it might have let her die less alone. I placed Mariella gently on the shelf beside the hearth, her glass eyes catching the flicker of flame. What will become of the doll? I asked. Holmes answered, without turning. She'll remain here. A reminder, not of the crime, but of the clarity only a child had the courage to preserve. Granger rose and extended his hand. Holmes took it with a firm grip. You've done more than any constable or inspector could have, Granger said. You listened when no one else did. After Granger left, we sat for a long time without speaking. The day turned to dusk, the fire deepened, and the city's heartbeat echoed through the windows in the form of rain against glass. Eventually, Holmes reached for his pipe, but didn't light it. Watson, he said, in all our cases, we follow footprints, bloodstains, pocket watches, cigar ash, tangible things. But it is rare to solve a mystery through a child's fears, a doll's silence, and a buried name. I nodded. And yet, perhaps those are the truest clues. He looked at me then. I dare say you're right. Outside, the lamplighters moved through the fog, and a single bell tolled from Marylebone. Inside, the porcelain figure watched from the shelf, still and eternal. Mariella the doll, that had once held an alibi, now held something else entirely, a memory, a warning, a truth no longer hidden, and at last, a home. The end.